Hi, and welcome to this panel discussion on anti-racism and mental health. My name is Meghan Yuri Young, and I moderated the event. To give you a little context to the panel, it was held on July 7, 2020, shortly after the murder of George Floyd in the United States. Calls to action against anti-Black racism prompted global scrutiny and examination on systematic racism found not only in law enforcement agencies, but also in education, private, and public institutions. At this time, the spread of COVID-19 forced a lockdown in Canada, isolating people with social restrictions and shifting the normalcy and freedoms we all knew. The panel discussion unpacks some of the difficult issues that we were all processing in our own ways and tries to help generate some beneficial discussion around these events. The panel was a U of T faculty of kinesiology and physical education, sport and rec, and the SAG Collective Partnership. And before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panelists. Natacha is a registered psychotherapist who works from an anti-oppressive, healing-focused, trauma-informed, and anti-Black racism lens to unpack and challenge the euro-centric practices that have been central to the generational traumas of racialized communities. Asante is a leader in mental health. A veteran of the speaker circuit, Asante has presented across the globe, including a pair of TEDx talks telling stories dealing how family trauma impacts mental health. Through his work, he has also been named a CAMH 150 difference maker. Suzanne is a member of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation. She is director of the Wakpenes Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health and a registered psychologist and associate professor of Indigenous healing and clinical counseling psychology at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Punita is a higher education professional specializing in equity, diversity, and inclusion. As a skilled strategist, research analyst, and coordinator, Punita has led a variety of published and award-winning research projects in higher education institutions, such as Muslim Perspectives on Racism and Equitable Practices in Canadian Universities. Emily is a prevention and promotion worker at Hung Fook Mental Health Association, a community organization in Toronto. Hong Fook works with Asian communities to keep people mentally healthy and manage mental illness from recovery to wellness through promotion and prevention, treatment, capacity building, and advocacy.
I want to open up by touching on specifically the Black experience. There's been an incredible amount of information surfacing since the death of George Floyd. I think we can all agree there's a lot of reasons why this has all come about, from coronavirus to objective videos that have been coming up to light that we just cannot deny now. And but there's just such an influx of information that Natacha and Asante specifically, maybe we'll start with Natacha. What are your thoughts on this newfound hyper-awareness?
So it's really interesting, right? Now, there is a hyper awareness. A lot of people are talking about anti-racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. However, this is not new, right? This may be the current headline. However, this is not new. I think Dr. Jill Andrews had spoken about that, you know, it's not new. It's not the new headline. This is an issue that's now, it's a movement that we're seeing now. However, myself, Asante, you spoke about this as well. We've been going through this. This is our lived experience. This is an experience of Black and Indigenous folks for hundreds and hundreds of years. So yes, it is a movement now that has erupted because of the murder of George Floyd. However, this is something that we have been going through for a long, long time. Anti-Black racism, if we speak about from a mental health perspective, anti-Black racism is part and parcel of the mental health of Black and Indigenous folks. That anti-Black racism is something that is not taken out of it, but it's a part of. So it's really important when we speak about what's going on now about anti-racism, anti-Black racism, that we really have to understand that this is something that's been happening for a really long time, for generations, and it does have a really huge impact.
Asante, do you have anything to add?
A little bit. Thank you, Natacha, for saying that. I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, this stuff has been going on for a very, 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 very long time. And it's just now that people are paying attention. You know, the other day, I heard a quote that said that, you know, racism isn't new, it's just being filmed. That was, I think, from Will Smith. But anyway, you know, in saying all that, you know, one of the concerns I have right now is that this is kind of a hashtag situation, or a situation that is temporary, within the particular frame of time that we're living now, and that it doesn't carry forward and become, this conversation doesn't become normalized and a part of our day-to-day discourse, so that we can really, honestly and authentically look at it and then do something about it. So for me, that's a big goal that I see. As far as a hyper awareness, it's been a little ironic sitting from my position to watch it happen, because I'm hyper aware every time I leave the house, right? So, I'm 6'4". I'm a, pretty dark skinned black guy. I have a pretty deep voice. So I walk outside the house every day, and I'm hyper aware of how my blackness how others might perceive my blackness in such a way that how might that impact or affect my life, in not just on any particular day, but in any particular situation that I'm walking into, whether it's going into a convenience store or walking into a boardroom, right? So I'm always hyper aware. In saying all that, I really hope that we can continue this conversation and keep it going with regard to anti-Black racism. And for, now that people are seeing us, to continue seeing us, but also not to see us in such a light that, we are not to be, I'm not sure how to put this, but like taken care of. It's more so that we just want to be treated fairly.
You know what's interesting? Oh, sorry, go on.
No, I think I'll wrap up there. I'm talking a lot.
What's interesting though is, so I do want to I want to give a little bit more background into the Black experience, and then moving on to the Indigenous experience before we launch into more of the nitty-gritty parts of this conversation, just to give an overview. But Natacha, when we spoke, we talked about the superwoman syndrome. And so it's interesting to hear from Asante, not to be taken care of, maybe perhaps not to be coddled, and yet through what I've been slowly learning and coming about and hearing about, that a lot of other cultures, specifically the white folks, can look at Black folks and say, well, they're stronger. They can take this. They've been taking this. Natacha, can you?
Yeah, and that's one of the issues, right? Like, yes, there is this syndrome that's a superwoman syndrome. For those of you who are not aware, the superwoman syndrome is all about the woman, particularly the Black woman, being really strong, really resilient, really being able to take things because we're able to deal with it better. But the whole idea of that is exhausting. It's exhausting to carry, and it's one of those expectations that is passed down from a generation to generational thing, but it's exhausting, it's heavy, it's a lot to carry. And even the whole idea of being resilient, it's problematic, even that sentence that, yeah, you're resilient, you're strong, you could take things, you can go forward. But what about that self-care aspect? Mm-hmm. When is it that we as Black women, that we're able to stop and say, you know what? Yeah, okay, I have been resilient, but this is a lot to take. Mm-hmm. I don't want to have to be resilient. I want to be in a position where I can say, I can stop and I can take care of myself. Mm-hmm. So the whole idea of not being coddled, I completely understand that, because it's I don't want to be coddled by other people, but I want to be given space that I can step back and say, you know what, yes, I've been caring for everybody, but now is my time to take care of myself. So if we're really talking about the Black experience, the whole experience about the Black woman being strong and being capable and being able to have it and being able to take care of everyone else, there's so much problem in that. If we look back from a historical and from a colonialization mentality, the Black woman has been taken care of, whether it's from the family. We look at domestic workers who came in a lot of times to the country is caring for, mm-hmm. cooking for, mm-hmm. right? Taking care of the children, even wet nursing, right? Mm-hmm. It's taking the idea of taking care of other people. So when we talk about the strong Black woman, yes, historically, Black women have been strong. However, Black women are shouldering and carrying a lot, and it is a weight.
And now to put a foil on that, Asante, I just want your thoughts on, we spoke before in preparation of this conversation, we spoke about the mystique around the Black man, about how already there's the male culture of masculinity and what it is to be masculine, to, you know, to guard your feelings to the point where you can't even maybe relate with your own emotional world. But then there's the added layer, Asante, of the Black men, and how they're super athletes, incredibly well endowed. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, I definitely can. I can't count the amount of times I walk into a room and the first thing someone has said to me is, "How high can you jump?" And it's like, how well can I think? How about that?
Right.
Going back to what Natacha was saying, I just want to, hop on a few of her points before I address your question, Megan. I really envision a world where we don't, where we could create an environment where Black people don't need to be so resilient all the time. Going back to what I was saying, I guess what I was talking about was white saviorism. And one of the things that I'm seeing emerge as we talk more about anti-Black racism and the hyper-awareness is that, I see a lot of white saviorism happening. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, that's something I've been noticing. As far as the Black experience also, I also want to just clarify that, we're not monolithic. There are so many different Black experiences. I'm a Caribbean-born person, so my Black experience is going to be seen through that lens, whereas someone who was born in Ghana or someone who was born in South Africa, they'll have a different experience. So now addressing your question, Megan, as far as the masculinity piece, I think there's a lot of discourse around the challenge of, toxic masculinity and how that might impact how male-identified people walk through the world and how they perceive the world, perceive themselves, compete with each other in different ways socially for resources, et cetera, et cetera. When you add in the layer of Blackness, I feel like what happens, or what does happen in society, is that Black men are we're given masculinity times 10 in terms of perception. So, I have to be the super athlete. I'm tough. I can fight. I can do all these, super masculine things that we see in comic books. And what that does is really, it diminishes the entire experience of the person, diminishes my experience, diminishes my personhood. And all of a sudden I become demonized, I become fetishized, and I am no longer a person walking through the world. I am a bunch of stereotypes walking through the world. And some folks might look at these things and say, well, those are positive things that people are saying about you. And I choose to, zoom out and see it differently. And, if that's what you're expecting and I am not that, then what am I to you? Or if you're not seeing the full picture of me, then you're not seeing the other ways in which I might be able to walk through the world and contribute to it, and the other ways I bring richness to this experience that we all share as human beings on the planet of Earth, right? So it's a really problematic thing in so many different ways. It's dehumanizing, and it certainly doesn't help a lot of, I see it a lot with the youth that I work with, where sometimes we internalize these things, and because of that internalization of these, racist tropes about us, that we don't believe that, we can seek help, or we don't learn to identify with our emotions. We don't learn to identify the emotions that we have. We just kind of exist in this place of, we have these things inside of us, but we're not sure what they are or what to do with them.
Asante, I'm actually, definitely that leads into another question later on. So hold on to those thoughts.
Got it.
But right now I'm actually gonna call on Suzanne, because the Indigenous experience is sadly very similar to that of the Black experience. When you and I spoke, you mentioned that it's important to include a very strong Indigenous voice to touch on that similarity. Can you expand on that sentiment?
Yeah, and thank you for having me as well. I kind of rushed through my introduction because I was a little nervous being around all these awesome other panelists, and I don't want to take up too much time. But to answer your question, and just to echo what Asante and Natasha have said, is, you know, Indigenous peoples in Canada are extremely diverse. And Indigenous people do not all have the same experience by any means, because there's light-skinned Indigenous people. There's, like, I have kids who are all status Indians. You know, they're Indians under what Canada defines as an Indian, but one of them is really pale and white and even has blue eyes because their dad. And so they think, and then my kids and their friends or whoever, they see me and they think, oh, she looks super native, but I don't even see myself like that. I just see myself as a regular person. But how the world sees me really influences how I get treated, you know, as a native person. They don't know maybe that I'm a doctor, or I don't live in public housing, or I don't have a social worker. But like Asante was saying, all these assumptions come in that are built on negative stereotypes, or assumptions that are built on positive stereotypes, like that I'm spiritual. Or here's the thing I get a lot from other professionals is, oh, you're so resilient, to go on what Natasha's saying, which I find really demeaning and insulting, in fact, because that concept of resiliency, which comes from Western psychology, ensures that, like, has in it, that it's embedded in it, is that kind of filial patriarchal, like, poor little you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and you overcame all these horrible things, and you're better than all the other ones who didn't make it. Where does that leave? If I'm resilient, where does that leave all the people who didn't make it to where I am? So so we have to be really careful when we use these Western psychological or mental health terms, that they're being used in a context that doesn't further marginalize and oppress people. And when it comes to Indigenous mental health, and I'm going to speak about that generally because I'm a clinical psychologist and a health researcher, and I work with patients regularly still from the Indigenous community, is that the major barriers to Indigenous mental health are racism and access. Not biology, not individual difference, not what's wrong with the person, not their personal experiences. It's about the racism that they experience when they go to get help, which is, you know, things that you wonderful people are dealing with in your work. I heard everyone here talk about the work they do to provide what's now called culturally safe and culturally based mental health services. Those need to happen. And then access. Well, you know, our people, Indigenous people, don't have the same free access, free meaning not just financial, but available access to culturally safe or culturally based services, whether they live in the city or whether they live in a rural or reserve area. What most people don't know in Canada is that the majority of Indigenous people live in urban areas. If you want to see a Native person, go to downtown Toronto, because that's where the largest number of Natives are in Canada, is in Toronto. The highest rate, population-wise, of Native people is in Winnipeg or Saskatoon. But we actually have the largest number of Natives congregated in one place in all of Canada, right here in downtown Toronto. So, so these issues about Native mental health are really, in some ways, urban issues. And urban Indigenous people are largely ignored by the system. When you hear everything that the government's talking about helping Natives, what they're talking about is First Nations, which is a small percentage of our population. That ignores the Métis, that ignores the Inuit, and that ignores disenfranchised Natives, so people who had to leave their reserves because of persecution and gave up their rights as Indigenous people, their rights in air quotes, because they're not really rights. I mean, as everyone on this panel knows, and maybe some people who are listening, Indigenous people do not have the same human rights that non-Indigenous Canadians have by Canadian law. Because we're not considered to be equal with Euro-Canadian Christian identities.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous mental health is also different because we define mental health across all of our different cultures as balance between and within the four aspects of the self: the mental, the physical, the spiritual, and the emotional. Whereas the biomedical mental health system, which funds all of our health services, defines mental health by the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which defines mental health as the absence of disease.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the World Health Organization, Public Health Canada has somewhat more holistic definitions, but they still are not really far from staying in that biomedical place, which really continues to perpetuate the racism and the lack of access that our people experience with respect to mental health.
We're actually definitely going to touch on that a little bit more later on as well. But thank you so much. There was a lot of that I'm still learning and I still wasn't aware of. And we spoke for an hour and I felt like I learned so much from you. So I think both you, Suzanne, and Asante and Natasha from their past panel last year, we spoke about communities within communities, because I think before, again, one last thought on this before we really move into the other parts of the conversation, and please, Punita and Emily, chime in as well. This is a question for all of you, but what did I write here? The importance of recognizing and distinguishing communities within communities in order to better understand how different cultures affect an individual is paramount, I believe, in having culturally safe spaces in our healthcare systems. Does anyone want to elaborate on that concept of communities within communities?
I think, Megan, you and I had spoken about that as well last year, and I think this time as well. Like, I speak a lot about Black communities, like really having that understanding that we as Black people, we come from various parts of the world. So there is a Black community, something that connects us, and that's the melanin of our skin, but we come from different cultures and different ethnicities, even different faiths. So we have to be very, very mindful that there are communities within communities. And then if you put on then these stereotypes, which a lot of times there's like these Western expectations of how racialized peoples are, we have to be very, very mindful, because some of the stereotypes, as Susan and Sante both mentioned, some of the stereotypes are quote unquote good stereotypes, but really they're really harmful stereotypes, because this is expectation that people from these communities are all lumped together. And if you think about it, it's also from a dualistic mindset. It's either you're really, really good or you're really, really not. And that's so problematic. So this idea of communities within communities, it's really understanding that there's variation, right? There's cultural variation between peoples and between where we originate from, as well as the cultures which govern our families.
Does anyone want to add to that? Even, Emily, I know that's a thing within the Asian community as well, recognizing, again, that there are, and I think it's a little bit more distinguished for the Asian community, but I could be wrong. So do you want to speak on that?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. And I can relate it to this pretty much growing up in Toronto, because obviously people don't know if we really are Vietnamese or we're Chinese or we're Korean. So we all just Chinese or we all just Asian. But a lot of time when culture for a lot of our youth and myself growing up, seeing that's not only discrimination, stereotype outside the home, but also it's inside the home. I can relate it to Asante about this, like 6'4" Black man with deep voice. I remember growing up as a young girl, my grandfather always say, um, uh, now that he passed away, and rest in peace, but he always say, you know what, you have to be careful, and it's already racism or stereotype within the family, within the immigrants community. At that time, quite small and minorities as well. You can see that it's different community already. We're learning to discriminate each other due to a bigger society. I remember even with a lot of my younger students, they come from a country where all of us are Asian, or majority of us is Asian, and since white people or Black people are very, very small population, and now that they have to expose to a bigger society where I forgot which panelist was talking about, is that sometimes they internalize their own issues. They do not talk about it when they see you so big, so scary looking, and if they experience something, they don't voice out their issues. Keeping within themselves if they get discriminated against or so is something that Asians, young individuals or Asians community does do sometimes, because it's just that, first of all, language issues. And again, Natacha was talking about is that, we different roles of the person. They can be different in the family, and then they can be outside in the community and get treated differently when they voice out their racism or something that they get mistreated. And that's also carried with them for the experience for a very long time.
That leads actually really well into my next question. Last year, the panel that inspired this conversation focused on how cultural background and upbringing affects our relationship with our own mental health, hence the inclusivity of our panelists. This year, I want to address how this isn't just a white versus Black issue. This is a systematic issue stemming from white supremacy and privilege, and many non-Black folks are complicit in upholding that. What are your thoughts on that? Panita, I'm actually going to throw this one to you. When we spoke, we touched on this idea that brown people maintain ties to whiteness by idolizing it and benefiting from it. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So just also to echo some of the conversation that was happening earlier. So right now, since the George Floyd incident, there's been a lot of, or tragedy, I should say, there's been a lot of talk within the South Asian community and the brown community about how we can step up as allies and what is our role in combating anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. And my worry is when I'm seeing all of this is that it might fade away too soon before these conversations have had a chance to make a real change in the community. I think when it comes to, brown people in general and South Asians in particular, there's a lot of trauma still, intergenerational trauma from colonialism and continued trauma from racism that we face. But what we haven't been able to unpack fully is how we've internalized that racial hierarchy that we've learned from colonialism, and then how that manifests itself within our communities as anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. In particular, when it comes to Indigenous people, even if there's no racism there's sort of almost like this unwillingness to even learn about what are the indigenous issues in Canada. And again, it goes back to this idea of resilience, right? Like, we came as immigrants, we worked hard, and we've made it somehow, right? And so therefore, it's like this merit piece, right? Like, we're able to do it, we're able to be successful, why can't everyone else? And then they're then unable to look at systemically how this, like, we're all operating in this oppressive system, and it's oppressing us, but we're at the same time we're benefiting from it by being model minorities. So there's been a fair bit written on South Asian and Asian people as model minorities. I'm not fully it's a very contradictory concept of South Asians and Asians, because on one hand we can talk about South Asians as being a model minority, but then we also can look at the violence that all the cab drivers face who are, you know, South Asian. And so, like, how is this model minority concept being played out in society? I think in addition to these spaces that I'm seeing opening up where we're talking about allyship and addressing anti-Black racism, I would also want to see spaces opening up where people are able to come together and talk about, what does it even mean to be brown? And how have we internalized racism? And what is our own trauma? And those are conversations that are still, they're not happening openly. And so in particular, I'm thinking right now even of the split in India, right? So I'm of an Indian background. There's a lot of stories that have been passed down by grandparents, you know, to their children and grandchildren about how the split of India happened and how many people lost their lives and the violence involved. And I think even just within the South Asian community, and I'm thinking of, you know, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, like, how can we even begin to talk about that and heal as a larger South Asian community while addressing all of these other bigger systemic racisms? And so I would love to see more spaces open up for those conversations.
I thank you so much for those thoughts, both Emily and Punita. It's so interesting to hear your perspectives from myself specifically, because I'm half Korean and I'm half Sri Lankan. And so it's always been very interesting to, I think I completely identify being Canadian, and yet I have these strong ties to, you know, my Korean and my Sri Lankan backgrounds in very different ways. And my best friend is actually Tamil and I'm Sinhalese. So I've learned so much through her and the experiences and that divide between in Sri Lanka is solely because my best friend is so curious and she learns, and then she kind of imparts that knowledge to me. And then so hearing that again, it instills in me this respect for the spectrum of cultural experiences, right? Again, within the culture and then amongst cultures. It's so complex. And I think that's something that we're learning at the beginning of all of the resurgence of Black Lives Matters. But as Punita, as you mentioned, there's that that danger of losing that momentum and losing that actual learning and then falling onto stereotypes again, maybe in a better, more educated way, but still putting it to rest and getting on with our daily lives. Suzanne, I'm going to go back to you because there was something that you said in our conversation about this, what Punita brought up in terms of the model immigrant and how, you know, we have to always come from a place of empathy that people do what they have to do to survive. Do you want to speak on that?
Thank you for inviting me to speak about this. And I was just listening to what Punita was saying and Emily just before her. And I think, you know, so a lot of Indigenous people have internalized, and myself included, and I would say that all people who experience systemic and personal oppression of some kind have internalized to larger or smaller degrees colonialism, patriarchy, racism, because we have to do that to survive that oppression, right? We have to do that to a degree, whether it's small or large. And for many Indigenous people, this happened directly through the residential school experience and child welfare experiences, where we were all told Indians are bad, you're bad, you know, everything about you is wrong, and you have to change to basically be white. You have to look white, you have to think white, you have to dress white, you have to practice Christianity, you have to do all these things. So we were directly told that being dark and being Native was bad in every way. So many people had to kind of internalize that just to survive those experiences, right? These are little kids, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, you know, who spent many years, my parents, my brothers and sisters, you know, like I'm the oldest of 7 kids, and there's only a few of us who didn't go to residential school. My younger siblings all went to residential school. This isn't something that happened hundreds of years ago. This is something that is direct impacts of colonization. So people who go through these really traumatic experiences have to do what they have to do to survive, right? And our job as wounded people who are wounded from the very personal aggressions and assaults of colonialism, of the system, it's our responsibility to heal from our wounds, right? It's our responsibility to heal those wounds that we got in residential school, in foster care, in, you know, the abuse and the neglect that we experienced because of the colonial laws of the Indian Act that became personal on each of us. And that's our responsibility to heal those wounds. It's not our responsibility to turn that anger and hatred onto other people and to continue to turn it onto ourselves, right? That's that internalized colonialism or racism or whatever, however you want to couch it, because colonialism and basically the whole framework of Canada is totally racist and based on white supremacy to all people, not just us, to everybody. To anybody who's not white, you're at a disadvantage policy and law-wise in Canada. And that's what we have to change, right? We can all sit and talk about what we think is wrong and what we know is wrong and what's bad that's happened. And because we all know that that's true from our personal and professional experiences, but we're not going to actually really change anything until we push the people who are in control, and that's the government, to make those changes that they need to make, or we kind of do the ring of fire, which is we just go our own way and do our own thing and make our own changes. And that's sort of what we're doing by coming together. All these unfortunate things that have happened to my people and your people and your people and your people that are in the news now, they've been happening a long time. My mother was raped by our CMP. Nobody did anything. My relatives have been killed by the police, by the Indian agents, by all people. Nobody cared. Nobody did anything. Now it's capturing national attention everywhere. And the result is that we are all coming together. We're coming together to have these conversations. And by coming together, we're resisting the very successful tool of colonization, which has been divide and conquer. And that's the power that we have right now, is that we can stop being crabs in the bucket because we've been forced to do that to survive. And we can actually come together and support each other and lift each other up and say, you know, my Black brother, my Asian sister, my Southeast Asian cousin, all of you, we're all together and we're going to work together, and we can't change the system, which maybe we can't. I don't actually believe we can, but that's just because of 30 years of trying to do this, and really nothing's different than it was 30 years ago, in my opinion. We could just go our own way and do our own thing. You're all doing your own thing. You're helping people. So I'm going to stop now because I could go on.
Thank you so much. I like to share that. I think, Suzanne, you're very powerful to share that message. And I agree with you. It is our responsibilities to continue to educate people around us. I like to share this. I think we talk about it, Megan, that it is, unless you experience it firsthand, you don't know how deeply affect a person. I run a youth support groups, and this is way happened before, even in I guess November, December. That's when the virus has just started, and a lot of people were saying that it's from China and it's from Asia. And a lot of our students actually get treated differently, spat at, and even if they sneeze or cough, they would just 2 or 3 meters away from them immediately. So a lot of our youth were talking about, if you want a seat on the subway, you just cough and people would just spread out. And it's hurtful until they get a little bit physical, I guess, harm to them, like spat or push or call them name. And then it becomes, after Mr. Floyd, unfortunate events happen, when I talked to them, I said, just imagine, you remember how upset you were when you get treated a few months ago they call you virus, they called you to go back to China or wherever you come from. This individuals, this community, Black community, have experienced it for many years on top of this. So time your upsetness to that thousands of times. How would you feel? So Suzanne, you're right. You're absolutely right. Every single one of us need to educate and relate people experience to the real experience. That's the way for people to see that if we don't act upon these racist and stereotype and violence against a human being, it would never stop. It would never stop. And that's where my students were saying, oh, you know what? I would like to go and do a peaceful protest, even though I'm not Black. And I don't want this to happen to anybody, because I know how it feels to just happen to me a few months ago.
I made a note of that, Emily, because that was such a powerful thing, I think, when we spoke on the phone about how the Asian community has been currently going through their own racist experiences as well at the beginning of coronavirus, and how that related to them relating themselves to the anti-Black racism that is currently being globalized around the world now. And I'll leave this one thought before we move on to the next question. In speaking with each of you, the panelists over the last month in preparation for this panel, it again reinforced that exactly what Suzanne was saying, is that maybe it's not changing the system we have, but it's building something completely new. And in that sentiment, it really is, especially within North America specifically. I know this is happening around the world, but specifically in our home, in our country, understanding, truly sitting and thinking. So after this panel, take a moment and really truly think and appreciate the fact that we all went through a very North American educational system, that we went through, you know, and this is for even specifically non-Black folks who and who are non-white as well, who maybe have feelings of, you know, empathy and sympathy that we all kind of feel like we can relate, but we really can't at the same time. And of course, I am speaking from, you know, first generation, second generation standpoint. Like, I was born in Canada, so I do want to acknowledge that as well. But it's just, it's this idea of implicit bias and just this covert, you know, systematic racism, that we understand these words. We get it now, we're learning them, but are we actually sitting and understanding that we have been brought up in this society, and how do we start the change from within and outwards? And understand that when we are interacting with others, that a majority of us in Canada are coming from that very North American space. So that kind of leads into activism. You know, there's been a huge, you know, uproar in terms of like how we're educating ourselves, how we're standing up for our, you know, our Black folks, our Black community, for ourselves even. Asante, you mentioned that in another life, in another life, you might have been a sports reporter, but because of the access you have, you chose a different path for your career. What did you mean by that, and what have you been doing?
It's a great question, Megan. I think what I mean by that is that I've been, you know, afforded certain privileges in terms of, you know, how, you know, the education that I've had, you know, the fortune to have a lot of good teachers growing up, and mentorship, and the right social worker to help me get through a lot of my upbringing. You know, a lot of things that brought me to the place where we sit today, where, you know, we're all having this conversation. And, you know, growing up, my ambitions were not at all anything to do with advocacy or to be in this kind of social workery space. Like, I actually was vehemently against wanting to do this stuff. But then, no offense to anybody, but that's just where my head was at. And then I realized, as I got older, you know, the impact that these things were not just having on me individually, but, you know, my neighbors, the people who lived in my community, my family extended across the world, and, you know, everybody, and white folks included, right? I mean, this is, you know, racism and white supremacy, as we're coming to understand it, is an issue for everybody. And I just so happen to have the privilege of a platform and a voice that may be able to make some kind of impact. And so I see it a little bit as my duty to use, you know, the power that I have. You know, like Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility, right? You know, in another life, maybe I would be a sports journalist, or maybe I would be the tech guy I wanted to be when I was 14 years old and I was writing code. But life has taken me in a different direction. And for me to be able to be here today and to do the things that I'm doing, and, you know, what I'm doing a lot, I've been talking about mental health for a long time, almost 10 years now, but I've been thinking about the things that we're talking about today with regard to racism almost my entire life. However, it has not been a quote unquote safe conversation to bring into the mainstream. And, you know, going back to what, you know, many of the panelists today have pointed out, it was, you know, talking so openly about racism, you know, prior to George Floyd's murder, might have had a detrimental impact on, you know, my career and my survival. But, you know, now we have, you know, some level of permission to talk about it, because we can't avoid it. Well, we never should have been trying to avoid it, but now we really can't avoid it. And so, you know, now I'm talking a lot about racism, and, you know, I'll be honest, I've been thinking more about racism throughout my life than I ever have about mental health, despite the fact that those two things for me are very, you know, intertwined like a knot. But you know, for me to be able to talk about this is to hopefully illuminate what is really happening, you know, on the ground in the world, in our communities, and to tell stories and to try to encourage folks to listen to each other. You know, one of the things I've been saying a lot lately in the many conversations I've had, you know, offline, online, in the news media, etc., is that my greatest frustration in this entire I don't know, revolution that is currently happening is that it took the murder of George Floyd in the way that it happened for people to listen to us and for people to believe us, right? Just speaking from a perspective of a Black person, is that we've been trying to tell these stories for a very, 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 very long time, very long time. I have personal stories myself. My brother's got personal stories. My mom got personal stories. We all got personal stories. We've been trying to tell y'all, just y'all weren't listening until you saw it on video from 3 different angles from beginning to end for 10 minutes, right? Why did it need to get that far before y'all believed us? So, you know, what I'm really trying to say right here is that, you know, moving forward, you know, please believe the experiences that other people are you know, generously giving to you in telling their stories. You know, as Emily was saying before, and Suzanne and Punita, you know, all of us, we have these stories, and it's now where we need to listen to them and really come together to try to build something where we can all live together peacefully and fairly and in a just society, because that's just not where we are right now. And we need to continue to move forward to do that.
Asante, I'm so glad that you brought up that point, because that was something that stuck out to me when you brought up, like, why didn't anyone believe us before? And I just want to reiterate that for everyone watching. Asante also had put it this way when we were on the phone: ask yourself this constantly: why didn't I listen? Why didn't I believe? And just constantly ask yourself that day in, day out, a month from now, a year from now. And this goes, you know, across the board. This is the same thing that women have been saying, you know, throughout the Me Too movement. Why doesn't anyone believe us? And that's not, I'm not asking for anyone to answer that right now, but I will go on to Natacha. We talked a lot about triggers and exhaustion, about having these same conversations over decades, about white folks now sharing other folks' racism. You asked, why is my story yours to tell, and why do I have to be the voice of all the Black people within your circle? Can we unpack that?
Yeah, that's a statement that needs a lot of unpacking. And I think, like the rest of my panelists, there's a lot of stuff that needs unpacking, right? So if we talk about why it goes back to privilege. Let's just start there. It goes back to privilege and power, that the idea of a white body saying, oh, okay, yeah, now I get it. I never asked myself the questions on why am I believing now, but now that I get it, now I can take all of our collective stories and tell it. That talks about power, and it talks about privilege. And the idea around someone else taking our stories and our narratives and making it their own, there's a lot of harm in that. It's harm because it goes back to cultural appropriation. It's that here is my experience as a Black woman, and here's another person, a white identified individual, who wants to take it and make it their story and get all the praise and the captioning and the follows from it, right? What it does, it takes the power out of it, because we have been telling these stories for years, but that's it. No one's been listening. So now that we're telling these stories, we have to also take ownership of the voice behind the stories and tell the story. Because these are real stories. They're real stories, and they're hurtful stories, and they're impactful stories, and they're stories that have been happening for a long time. And like Susan said, these are stories that we don't have to technically go back hundreds and hundreds of years. We can go back to your generation, as you spoke about your younger siblings. who've had experience in a residential school system, right? So these are stories and these are experiences that have been happening, and it's time for us to take that lead to tell these stories and have people to actually listen. I think one of the issues, not only from white folks, but also our own internalized racism, because all of us who have been educated, and I don't only want to say educated in Canada because I did my master's in the Caribbean and it's very much from a colonial perspective, right? So we have to understand all of us who have been educated, point blank, have been educated from a mindset of colonial thought and from a colonialized perspective. So we have to unpack that. We have to understand what has that done to me and myself, and as not only how I view others, but how do I view myself? Right? So we have to do that internalized unpacking. And then we have to get to a place of saying, okay, now what can I do to unpack the me, unpack my family, unpack the community so I can help to unpack the world? Because there is hurt. There is hurt and it needs to be healed. Now, all of us have our stories, and I have stories that I've been hurt by. And this is something that really resonates with me because I had a really, really good friend who's not, a non-Black racialized person who said some very hurtful and harmful and racist things, and being able to call that person out and being met by, no, I'm not racist. I don't have any implicit biases. That's harmful. So we do all have to do our own unpacking to be able to tell our stories. And we do need people to sit down and actually listen, because it's in the listening where the healing could start to be done. And we have to also understand that there is a lot of ingrained systemic racism that has happened, and only way for us to really get something done is, we sit like this and we have our conversations, but the reality is, as Susan mentioned, it's the government level that can make the changes and the policy changes, and that's where a lot of our voices need to be heard.
I love that, because that actually goes right into my other question, but I do want to make one comment about that sense of, validation of, oh, we are a good person now because we are finally seeing racism within ourselves and our communities, and we're talking about it, and we're sharing information. But I want to just leave, this is my opinion about that, is again, ask yourself and sit with yourself. For those of you, there's, nearly 250 people tuning in right now. I'm not sure what everyone's, relationship with social media is, from Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, but we're seeing, again, a lot of information. And as we retweet, repost, share our own thoughts and on our own stories, which may not even be our own stories, sit with what that feeling brings up. Sorry, my dog is snoring behind me. Sit with what feeling that brings up in you, and understand that a lot of the work, even though we should be vocal and stand up and show up, a lot of the work is also behind the scenes. I would argue most of the work is behind the scenes. So, ask yourself, what kind of feelings are you getting, and are you stopping there because you feel good that you've shared something? Or are you actually doing the work yourself? But as I had said, Susan, we spoke about defunding the police as an example of how change needs to start at a more fundamental level. And you had said, and I think you actually mentioned it earlier in this conversation now, about how, that's a great example, because we all get behind this. This is like one of the things that we actively get behind. But in reality, all it's doing is moving around the puzzle pieces. It's not necessarily changing anything. Can you elaborate on that, Suzanne?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the original sort of issue that we've all been talking about, and that's around being disempowered and not having a voice, right? So when the government, maybe the government, the cities or the National Police Service will say, yeah, we're gonna defund some of our activities and we're gonna put some of that money towards mental health or do something, and that's fine for a little bit, but that's not actually addressing the systemic problems. The whole system of justice, which is based on euro-centric Western model of punishment, needs to change. And that can only be done by changing the values and principles by which the justice system is built, which is right now built on colonial patriarchy, white supremacist ideology. That's what has to actually change. Defunding 10% of the police and putting that towards mental health is actually going to probably do very little. In fact, it'll probably do more harm, because it'll make us all think that something's happened, and then all the people will stop pushing for change. And then you'll end up like with what we have in Toronto, is you have that little medicine wheel next to the skating rink downtown. And then everybody thinks, oh, this is a Native friendly place. Meanwhile, Native women are getting pushed off the 24th floor of a building because they need help. So, you know, it's not really doing anything. And it's important. I mean, I just want to make it clear to people who don't know maybe about how Indigenous people live in Canada right now and how we've lived for the last couple of 100 years, is that we actually still don't have a voice in Canada at any level of the system of the country. We may be, as Indigenous people, invited to certain tables now. You know, there's an Indigenous steering committee for the city of Toronto. The police have Indigenous people on their task force and this and that. But, and I'm embedded in the university, as you know, but we actually are, we're at the table, but we don't have a voice, meaning nobody's listening to what we're saying that we need to do, despite the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, despite the so-called calls to action, which are just recommendations. They don't actually mean anything if nobody cares about them, wants to do any of that. Native people in Canada do not have a voice of influence for anything that happens to us still today, even though we're at the table now. And, you know, when you guys we talked about, you know, people are listening now to our stories and, you know, what's changed. I'm not sure what's changed, and maybe somebody else here has an answer, but I remember when Rodney King, I was there watching that because I was a young person at that time. Like, I'm not going to say how old I was. I'll let you think I was like 5 years old, but really I was a lot older. But when that happened and all the subsequent things that happened, that's very similar to what's happened now. But yet nothing was done. Nobody cared. Nothing happened. Some rap bands put out some awesome rap songs to get interest going, but nothing happened. 30 years later, however long it's been, something similar has happened, and it's gotten traction outside of us. Like, we're still outraged from what happened in the early 90s and what's happened before that and what's happened every day in our lives. And now other people are taking notice of that for some reason. I'm not really sure what. I would imagine because it benefits them in some way, not because they actually care about what happens to Black, brown, or other people. There's something else going on and I don't know what it is, and it would be great to try to figure out what that is, because then maybe there's a way we could leverage that to make actual systemic change that's going to give us some influence over what happens to our own people.
If there's any investigative journalists, that's a story right there. That's like a really amazing and important story that we can like dive into. And I had brought that up, Suzanne, about, you know, the example of defunding the police, because something started to, you know, but like sit in the back of my mind as I was like advocating for that, and as I was backing it. And I still think it's important, but because again, it's just continuing the conversation. But then as soon as we spoke, and you said, you know, well, if the change is made, and then what happens? Will we become complicit again? Will we complacent? Sorry. And that's again something to keep in mind as we move forward after this conversation. So I'm switching the topic again because the more I learn about mental health and now systematic racism, implicit biases, and other oppressive societal constructs, the importance and significance of language continues to be a crucial topic of discussion. Punita, to ease into this theme, you mentioned the frustration you feel over policing yourself all the time in conversation. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think as a racialized person, as a Muslim person, I've been policing myself quite heavily since 9/11. And you know, and before that as a racialized person in general, but particularly after 9/11, it became really important for not just for me. I think it was a general sentiment in the Muslim community that we needed to somehow prove our humanity to everyone else and constantly make sure that people weren't feeling afraid of us. Constantly trying to make sure that other people weren't feeling, you know, threatened in any way by the way that we're behaving or, you know, what we're saying. And so even when and that's continued till today. And so even when it comes to talking about things like racism and white supremacy, it's, you know, I find myself hyper policing myself, and this is something that people have written about. This like not only does the police or the system surveil you and sort of police you, but we also do a lot of it ourselves, right? And so, you know, when we're talking about things like racism, there's this constant fear of we're trying to, on one hand, explain our pain, but then explain it in a way that doesn't make the other person feel uncomfortable. So we're both at the same time. We're a victim of racism, but then we're also trying to make sure that the other person isn't reading us as, you know, a threat, and they themselves become a victim in the conversation. Then I don't know if that makes sense. And so, and that's really difficult. And I think also depending on context, right? Like the way that we talk about these things in an institutional setting like a university versus the way we're talking about it with friends or the way we might be talking about it on a panel. I think there's always sort of this fear of which words we're using and how we're using them, and even like what kind of emotion we might be expressing in the moment. And I think it's really harmful to the person, especially when you're relating a story, right? There have been many times, and I've actually stopped doing this now during talks, but there have been times during a workshop or a talk about Islamophobia in particular, and to illustrate the point I'm trying to make, I might share a personal story, and there'll always be someone from the audience who will want to dispute the story, right? It's just same as what we were talking about, like people don't believe you, right? It's like, how do you know that was Islamophobic? Like, how do you know they were, you know, how do you know you didn't upset them first, or whatever it is, right? There's always an excuse, or they'll want to defend the actions, right? They'll say things like, well, if, you know, if terrorism didn't exist, then we wouldn't have to say those things, you wouldn't have to experience those things, right? And so they're unwilling to sort of unpack their own bias, and they'll, you know, use that opportunity to attack, and that really hurts, right? In that moment, I'm, you know, standing there thinking, I'm supposed to be running this workshop, I sort of have this platform, and what I'm saying is being invalidated by people, and they didn't even live my experience, right? And so I've actually since then just stopped using any personal experience, and instead I've sort of bought into this, you know, the academic, bought into academia, where everything I say is backed up by research instead. You know, so according to this person, they researched this and they said blah 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 blah, because I just don't want to put myself in that position. So I think there's different ways that we end up policing ourselves, and how we're using language and how we're expressing emotion that comes up for racialized folks.
And I don't know if this is a proper correlation, but I think for any you know, white folks who are tuning in right now, you know, the idea of white fragility, white guilt, and then of course from what we spoke about with Asante and everyone actually, and Punita, you just brought it up again about not being believed. this is something, again, that we must sit with and understand, you know, that we need to listen and we need to learn, and that you, Panita, are the expert of your life and your story and your experiences. And that's something that I, you know, come to really appreciate learning in the last few years about narrative therapy, for instance, which positions, you know, the patient as the expert and the therapist as, you know, someone who's listening and learning, and then hopefully, you know, will help from there. So thank you so much for sharing that. Asante, we spoke about how gender norms play a role in how we communicate and relate to our emotional worlds, that male identifying folks aren't taught to properly identify with it, let alone critically assess or communicate our emotional worlds. How can Black men specifically cultivate the language to better understand that? And how can others help?
That's a big question.
I know.
You know, I'm not, I can't be the guru for all Black men. But, you know, I guess speaking from my limited perspective, I think it really comes, you know, I think we have to really recognize that a lot of what, you know, has been given to us in terms of what we should believe about ourselves is not healthy. And, you know, if we look at it historically, a lot of it is a result of, you know, the ideologies that are residues from slavery and colonization. That, you know, going back to what we were talking about earlier around the hypermasculinity piece, right? And, you know, so when we, you know, want to make a switch and a change now, I think what that really requires, if we're just going to talk about our responsibility in this, because I think it's not just our responsibility, there is our greater responsibility in terms of, you know, those who have power and privilege, but in terms of our responsibility, it really comes down to how do we talk to each other? What space do we make for each other? How can we reverse some of the narratives that we have about, you know, if you are showing an emotion other than anger, that's a negative emotion. That doesn't mean that you're a B word or whatever it is. And how can we normalize these conversations? And it's not going to be possible in every space right off the bat. It's a gradual normalization that, you know, needs to happen over time, with a lot of sensitivity and with a lot of strategy behind it. You know, I grew up, you know, downtown Toronto in the projects, so to speak, right? So if I walk into that environment right now and say, hey, everybody, let's, you know, share our emotions, that's not going to fly, right? So I have to build relationships within that community first, and then, you know, maybe show some examples as to how you can express yourself differently and still uphold yourself as a man or be masculine. And maybe that will then help change one mind in the room, and maybe that one mind helps, you know, they talk to their friends and say, hey, maybe we could think about this differently, right? There's a phrase that goes, each one teach one. And what that really means is that, you know, if we're going to make a difference in our community, sometimes it starts with one person. So if I can try to take whatever I have, and I'm not saying I'm a guru and I understand everything and should follow everything that I say, but you know, the efforts that I make, hopefully positive and impactful in a positive way, maybe I can change one mind, and maybe that one mind could change another mind, and then, you know, we continue the change and the ripple effect, and that ripple becomes a wave. So that's kind of how I see it. You know, I did want to talk a little bit about what Punita was just saying as well, in terms of the policing of language. And one thing that I've noticed as we are on this panel speaking together is, you know, we've been talking a lot about our own experiences, but we have not placed a lot of our focus on things like white supremacy and white privilege and the ideology and the pedagogy of whiteness and what that is, and how it is embedded in virtually all of our society, as, you know, folks who live on quote unquote North American land. And, you know, and we have to, you know, confront these things as a society, but it's also very important for white folks to be able to confront these things as well. Because again, as we're seeing in America, it's not helpful to anybody. Everybody's suffering. You know, there was a recent survey I read. It was a survey of folks in America who consider themselves truly happy, and the survey, the results came in February, or the questions were asked in February. So before you know, the coronavirus epidemic or pandemic really took hold, and it said that 14% of Americans consider themselves truly happy, which is to say that if we have created a society that is rooted in these principles of white supremacy, and no one is happy, maybe we need to take a look at the structure and think about it differently, right? So, you know, I'm a person who likes to be really transparent and to really look at the things as they are, and, you know, to do what works and don't do what doesn't work. And I think we have to be brave enough to sometimes have those uncomfortable conversations with each other. But for those who have power and privilege, with ourselves and you know, in the communities that, you know, you live in, and the families that you live in, hold each other accountable, and hopefully we can all move forward together and create a world that is fair and just. I know I keep saying that, but it's something that needs to happen.
Thank you, Asante. Suzanne, when we spoke, and I think you actually mentioned it again earlier on, about the power of labeling, and how it's intertwined in the journey of oppression within the mental health system. Can we speak on that again a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. Well, you know, as a clinical psychologist, you know, the crux of my later doctoral training was really about assessing and diagnosing patients. That's really the only difference between a psychologist and a psychotherapist, is that we have that legal, we have that controlled legal act of communicating a diagnosis, and then learning all the tools by which you do that. And you know, the mental health system that we have in Canada, which is what is supposedly being used to deal with all the mental health crisis in all of our communities, it's not just failing Native people and Black people and brown people, it's actually failing everyone. And that's because it's based on this deficit disease model that not only gives people a diagnosis, but it actually changes their identity. You know, in our many diverse Indigenous cultures, one thing we do have in common is that our name is part of our spirituality, and that's very important. When we get a name from someone who's important, sorry, could you just turn that off, please? It's background noise, sorry. When we get a name, that name is part of our identity, you know, from our traditional cultural principles and values. So when a health expert comes in and gives one of our people and says, you know, you're depressed, or you're bipolar, or you're schizophrenic, or you're whatever they've decided the person has, which they probably don't even have because they aren't capable of cross-cultural communication that's going to actually understand where the patient or the client is coming from. And they're labeling them and actually changing their identity, and thereby further oppressing and demeaning them and making them more helpless in society and taking away that voice, right? We're all trying to get our voice back, whereas actually the medical system, the mental health system is actually actively trying to take away our voices through just how it functions. And that's a huge problem, especially when it comes to the fact that Indigenous people, for example, every single one of us who are alive today is dealing with either direct or indirect colonial trauma, right? And trauma manifests itself in the body in many different ways. to cope, because we all have that, all human beings, we have that biological urge to survive, to maintain homeostasis, to keep alive. And we'll do whatever we have to keep alive, whether that's, you know, drink Listerine, shoot up drugs, hurt ourselves, hurt other people, do whatever. Our body is in a survival mode, and we're just doing what we have to do to survive. We're not an addict. We're not mentally ill. We're not all these Western things. We're actually just trying to survive. And we're doing, you know, we're doing the best we can in an abnormal situation that was put onto us that we didn't choose. So trying to understand that the mental health of Indigenous people and other people who may not fit within the colonial paradigm of health are actually, you know, operating under a system by which mental health is socially constructed and not an actual real thing. Because we have all these mental health initiatives, but what are they? Are they actually mental health? Well, are they wellness initiatives? Are they designed to actually further oppress and control people? And even their own people think that. Michel Foucault, a Western French philosopher, was the first person who said that in their own system that psychiatry was there to oppress and disempower people. Right? These are not new ideas, but these are ideas that we need to talk about right now, because our voice is the only thing that we have at this point that could actually mean the difference between life and death, because of where it's come to, because of what we're dealing with, because of these police brutality, because of the healthcare system, because of all these things, because of the pandemic. Everything depends upon our voice and empowering ourselves. So that, I don't know if that answers your question, Megan.
It did. It very much did. Thank you so much. I think I wanted to, you know, round off that specific theme with your thoughts on labeling, because it never occurred to me in that way. Like I had already delved into how important language was and using it as an identifier or reclaiming it. But then you added another layer that I'm still unpacking and learning more about when we spoke on the phone. And so thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that.
Actually, I just have to add one more thing to this, and that is I don't consider myself to be a Canadian.
Okay.
And most Indigenous people do not, if you were to ask them, do not consider themselves to be Canadians, because Canada isn't our country and by law excludes us from the same basic services and rights that Canadians have. And actually, under legal jurisdiction, we're not actually Canadians, we're wards of the Crown still today under the Indian Act. And that's a lot of part of what my colleagues here were talking about, is the need for people to understand how they're benefiting from the system. The way that Canada is set up infrastructurally as a country is that all non-Indigenous people benefit from all of the systems, the healthcare system, the justice system, the child welfare system, and the education systems, while Indigenous people are actually harmed by all of those systems. Indigenous people and other population minorities, meaning people who don't belong to the dominant culture, meaning they're not white, they're not Christian, Euro white Christian, they're not those things. So, you know, that's what non-Native and non-Black people who are allies, that's how they can support what we need to do to achieve equity and fairness and justice, as Asante is talking about, is they need to examine how they are benefiting from harms onto other people through these systems of our country. I mean, obviously people need to stop enacting personal racism. Like, that's just ridiculous. That's not necessary. And that's not something that like kind, empathic, responsible, nice people do.
Mm-hmm.
you know, like, duh. It's the system stuff that has to be, you know, like, it's the system stuff where people need to examine. Yeah, don't call someone like a bad word, obviously, but don't continue to benefit from and support systems that harm Native people and Black people and brown people and benefit you. Stop doing that. How? By changing the curriculum in education, by making the justice system less punitive and based on white supremacy, by making healthcare culturally based and accessible to all people. Like, there's so many ways, and if people don't know the ways, they can go look up the 92 concrete ways in the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report that says these are the actual ways that every Canadian can do something to stop benefiting themselves from the colonial system and stop harming Native people. And if those were changed, it would also stop harming other people who aren't Native, but who are also not white. So, I mean, people are like, what do we do? And I'm like, well, it's already written out there for you in 92 concrete ways. Pick something.
I am going to do that myself. I don't know if I've ever searched that. I don't know if I've maybe, you know, read it in different forms, but thank you so much. That's very actionable, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. I'm cutting into our Q&A, but I need to ask this question because this is the thing that, you know, will bring everything full circle. Healing. What, where, why, how do we heal from everything we just spoke about? Obviously a very big question, but you know, we've talked about generational trauma to the exhaustion of activism. Natacha, do you want to, I'm gonna ask everyone to keep, unfortunately, their thoughts a little bit more succinct, because I am gonna get into Q&As from those listening, the attendees, but healing in a very big, very big theme.
Yeah. So healing is a big theme. And the thing is, that is one of the things that binds everything that we're talking about, because Susan talked about the embodiment of trauma and how trauma lives within us. Punita was talking about how there's that defensiveness and white fragility, right? And there's so much stuff there. So how do we heal? How do we heal when we are the teachers? How do we heal when we are the clients? How do we heal when we have other people that are depending on us? It's a big conversation. So having conversations like this, there's healing here because it's validating, right? Like Pania's telling her story, and she's telling us about how she's leading that workshop, and there are people who are there who are, in my eyes, acting defensively, and there's healing that's needed there. So the way that we heal, we need to validate each other. We need to know that our voice, that it does matter, because there's many organizations and peoples out there and who don't value our voice, who don't value what we're saying. So we have to know that speaking and using our voice, it's valid. What we're speaking about is valid. What we're experiencing is valid. The trauma that we have gone through day in and day out, it's valid. It's not right, but it is valid. It is something that we have gone through, and it's something that needs healing from. So first, we need to validate our experiences. We cannot invalidate ourselves, because why would we treat ourselves the way our oppressors are treating us? We cannot do that to ourselves anymore, right? We cannot stand and be like, yes, 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 and take it anymore, because it's not right. We cannot be in that position anymore. So we need to validate ourselves. We need to understand that we belong. That's another big thing. Everything that we've been speaking about white supremacy and systemic racism, they're continuous messages trying to tell us that we don't belong, that we shouldn't belong. So we have to know that what we're feeling and what we're saying is valid, and that we belong. We have a right to be here as well. We have a right to speak our voice. We have a right to feel what we're feeling. And then what we really need to do, we have to allow ourselves permission to speak up. We cannot, we can't any longer be acting in the fear, Because a lot of times that's what it is the fear of what's going to happen. The reality has put this fear on us. So we need to have allyship in it. When I speak about allyship, it's not only that people who have the privilege and the power, white identified folks, they're the ones that are with us and fighting with us. We have to, within our own racialized communities, we have to really come together. We have to understand how anti-Black racism has really been ingrained in each one of us from our educational system and from larger systems. So we have to really come together and support each other and look inside and look to ourselves to understand that all of the ways in terms of anti-Black racism and colonialization, all this has been internalized, and we have to be able to unpack that. So those are some of the ways that we can heal. We have to be actionable. I love what Susan was saying. I wrote it down, the 92 Truth and Reconciliation Act, right? We have to really be actionable in what we're doing to be able to heal so we can thrive. A lot of the ways in which we've been acting, it has been for survival, right? It's been so we could survive. Now is a time that we have to thrive, and we can only do that together.
Punita, you actually spoke a lot about figuring out and finding who your true allies are in order to create healing spaces. You also said something that I think is so powerful, that we as in everyone, has to stop being afraid of being racist, identifying as a racist, in order to address that, learn, change, and heal from that oppressive state. Can you speak on that a little bit more?
So I actually don't remember that part of the conversation. That happens a lot, where someone's like, "Oh, you said that. Can you repeat that?" And I'm like, "I've forgotten already." But in terms of healing, yeah, there's this sort of idea of, and maybe this is what we were talking about, but sort of this idea of persistence, right? Where when you're sort of called out on, either your behavior or the behavior in your community, is sort of saying, it's unpacking that, admitting that, where you were wrong, and then sort of getting up again and saying, I'm going to do it right this time, and sort of figuring out who are those, what is that network that you can tap into to figure out how to do it right, and how to sort of relearn. Was that around?
Yeah. that was. I'm sorry. And I also, when I have these quotes pulled out from our conversations, a part of me sometimes thinks, oh, how do I lead you to say what I just said that you said?
Right. Yeah, no, you can just put it out there. You said this, I can talk about it. But in terms of healing itself, like I thought of it in a different way. So my first year at U of T, it was a really heavy year. There was a lot happening on campus. There was sort of the anniversary of the mosque shooting in Quebec coming up. There was then the New Zealand mosque shooting. And then some of you may have noted the article in the Varsity about the Muslim students worried about surveillance on campus by different legal agencies. And so one of the things I sort of asked myself is, and what I was asking the students is, what do we need right now to feel okay? So I guess it was before the even healing part, is where do we get to a space where we just feel okay and then move on? And so the idea, or the discussion of access and resources kept coming up. And I know we've sort of touched on this. What are the resources available for racialized folks in general, but then also on campus here at U of T? And so, as a person who myself was really new to U of T, I actually couldn't figure out the pathways to gain access to those resources where we can start to feel okay and start to heal. And it was at that point when I really sort of started looking around and trying to figure out, well, who are my allies? And what strengths do we all have, and how can we leverage these strengths to start creating a space that's really needed? And so, different things, there were a number of different workshops and discussions that then happened within the Muslim community on campus. There was also just even simple things like having you know, a team of lawyers and advocates from the community come together and actually lead a presentation on what do you do when you're stopped on campus? Like, how do you talk to a police officer? Like, these things were just unknown, right? What happens, like, what are your rights even? And actually the Canadian Federation of Students, along with the national, a national Canadian Muslim advocacy group, have created a guide for Muslim students on campus, and that's a national guide, and I can put up the link, and it covers everything from, you know, policing on campus to, you know, how to get accommodation for a religious observance. And so that space actually provided a lot of healing. A lot of fear that students were holding in was released in that space. And, you know, even for me, just sort of seeing a team of, you know, Muslim professionals and Muslim lawyers, all of us, you know, validating our experiences and our fears, but then also letting us know what our resources are and, you know, what we need to do next. That was a huge source of relief, I think, for people on campus.
Thank you, Punita. So in light of the time, I'm actually just gonna quote Asante and Emily on 2 points about healing that if you want to, you can elaborate, but I do want to get to some of the Q&A questions. So Asante really, I think he related it back to athletic training, and that if you are, you know, a professional athlete, and this is more in maintaining maintaining our activism, maintaining our energy levels, maintaining our mental health, right? Taking it from a different stance. But if we, you know, if we come from it from a professional athletic standpoint, you know, we understand that we have to, you know, pace ourselves. Don't go hard, really, really hard one day and then take 4 days off. But if we pace ourselves, we can actually, you know, maintain that level of energy throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year. And then Emily spoke a lot about giving others the space to think about their own journey and what their journey is going to be. I think what I'm seeing a lot of, and I think I'm not one to call out, but I do understand the importance of holding people accountable these days. But I think that also takes away from their own growth, because when we call out or when we pinpoint an individual's insensitivity or racism or whatever the case may be, that can actually derail them as well. We have to acknowledge that everyone works at their own pace. And so I think that was a very important point that Emily made in regards to healing. And I'm so sorry to like rush that through your own point, but
so that if I may, just one more thing is that because we all professionals here in any kind of level, if you cannot heal alone, let's just include us. We can heal together. Reach out to the professionals, any one of us, and we can just talk. And then if we cannot direct you to, we cannot answer your questions, we direct you to a person that can. And I think we have a very diverse panel here, and I'm assuming that you folks also agree with me that we can heal together. Nobody can do this alone.
Exactly.
I agree. Okay, I'm reading questions. So I'm actually going to start with the very first one that Robin, our organizer, sent me, because it was something that we actually unpacked in our conversation yesterday before hopping on. On the theme of language, what does the term ally signify to you each? How do you feel about it? Is there a better term? Accomplice, co-conspirator? Does the term even matter?
You know, I'm going to take a shot at this one. I think allyship for me, what that means is really being invested, and not, you know, performative, and not doing it just because others are doing it, or it's going to make you look good either in public or on social media. Allyship means being curious about the experiences of people who don't share the same identities as you, to having compassion about those experiences and compassion for their pain, and trying to do what you can in your own life and your own experience to help reduce the pain of others, so that others can be treated fairly and justly. You know, I say that as a, you know, a heterosexual cisgendered male. So one of the ways where I try to exercise my own allyship are for folks in the queer community, where, you know, I can, you know, step up to one of my friends who might say something that, you know, might contribute to, you know, a lot of the issues that exist out there, and say, hey, you know, maybe we should, you know, talk about that thing that you just said. And like you were saying, Megan, not necessarily to, you know, label someone, oh, you're a homophobe. It's more so, okay, let's unpack that thing that you just said, and think about why it might be harmful for someone who it may not harm me or you directly in a way that's tangible or visible to us, but it may harm someone else in their experience of life. So let's talk about that.
Thank
For
you.
for me, allyship is not invalidating someone's experience, and also the person being able to be very reflexive on what they've done, what they've said. Because a lot of times people think that they are allies, but they're not very reflective on the ways in which they think or carry themselves, or what they talk and do, how that can be very invalidating. So for me, it's the invalidation and being very reflexive, and also that there's some action there, and also holding yourself accountable. Right? Being able to say, you know what, I've really taken time to reflect on what I've done and what I've said, and I'm holding myself accountable that that was wrong. That's how you really develop an allyship, because it's someone that you can trust in building that relationship with.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on the term, the use of the term itself?
Suzanne here. I don't, myself, I don't really like the term ally or allyship, just because it makes me think of like it's a war term, right? Like it makes me think of World War II and the Allies and the Axis power, and it continues to keep that us and them and that dividing sort of mentality just through the language, even if it's like subtle or unconscious. So I don't really like that, but I also don't really care, as long as people are nice and genuine and doing it for the right reasons. I don't care what we call them, you know, or what they call me even, as long as it's how it's done. And to echo, you know, what my colleagues have said, those are all important, as well as, I guess the one thing that I see as sort of negative with a lot of allies is that they come in and they take over. You know, I don't think that it's a good policy to put non-Indigenous or non-Black or non-Brown people in positions of leadership within any type of Indigenous, Black or Brown sort of movement, organization, project, whatever. Don't come in and take over. Mm-hmm. That would be probably like my biggest piece of advice, because I see that all the time. Even the other day, I was in a big Indigenous mental health research meeting that is all Native people, like 18 Native people, and then one white woman. Well, who had the microphone and who was there telling all the rest of us, oh, this is what you need for Indigenous mental health? Meanwhile, everybody's texting each other saying that woman's got to shut up, but nobody said shut up because it's not in Native people's culture to tell people what to do. We all just patiently waited for her to finish. And then we're like, we got to find a way to get her off this meeting.
I think that's another interesting point too, is, you know, are you calling yourself an ally, or are other people acknowledging that you are an ally? So I think everyone brought up great points, and Suzanne especially said, you know, there's a lot of hostility almost attached to these words, and again we almost like cling to words in order to, because that's all we have to communicate and relate to each other. But I again sit there and think about it. Do you call yourself an ally because you're doing X, Y, and Z, when in fact, maybe you're not listening or learning. And so you think you're being an ally, but you're not allowing the community that you're trying to be an ally to tell you how to be an ally. I'm going to actually move on to a question from a U of T student. How does someone get it right? Tackling mental health, race, stereotypes in a way that isn't offensive, using platforms of art, or, and I think this is coming from a beginner's journey, like about social injustice. So, I mean, yeah, it's a big question as well, but how do you get it right?
I think what's important is to, you know, it's interesting as a former U of T student, that feels like a very U of T thing to ask. I think we have to let go of needing to be right all of the time. You know, there are going to be missteps and maybe some mistakes or maybe some points of embarrassment or shame. And that's okay. That's, you know, a part of, I think, any area of personal growth. So I think getting it right is really about, you know, trying your best and again, you know, bringing empathy and compassion into the conversation as much as possible. You know, recognizing that, you know, every human experience is a valid one. And to not invisibilize, I just made that word up, but, you know, to not make invisible the experiences of other folks. You know, for me, it's again, I'm big on stories, so it's about really hearing someone else and listening and believing them. Yeah, you know, it's going to be uncomfortable sometimes, and I think we want it to not be uncomfortable, but it's going to be. And the sooner we accept that, I think the easier it will be to kind of walk through this forest that we're trying to get through so we can get to the other side.
I think it's a process, right? We have to understand that life, as we're all living, it's a process of change and unlearning and unbelieving and relearning. So really be open to that process and don't feel as if you have to get it right the first time. Also about learning to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, because that's how change will take place. Once you're starting to move out of your comfort zone, then you allow for learning and allow for growth. So really start being comfortable with being uncomfortable, recognizing it's a process, and also asking. Don't be fearful to not know. And I think a lot of us we get scared of not knowing because how it's been ingrained that we're going to look. But be open and honest, say, you know, I don't know. I want to ask. I want to get out there and learn. So and really recognize that it's a process.
And I think for me, learning also to find your button, learning to find where you are on the line, and maybe sometimes maybe I'm not the right fit for you to walk alongside you. Maybe Natacha is, or maybe Meghan is. So learning how to put yourself into that line and move with it. Learning new skills, just like Natacha, unlearn what you learn or learn the new thing. And this is an opportunity for us to try so many things with this pandemics. We learn so many things, how to do our own way to make ourselves happy. There isn't one formula.
Mm-hmm. Final question, again from a student. How do you create and maintain healthy boundaries for mental health when BIPOC folk are in predominantly, sometimes only, white spaces?
Yeah, boundary creation is such a hard thing, and it's so important. I think especially when you're in a white space, recognizing within that space where you feel uncomfortable. right? Again, recognizing where you're uncomfortable so that you could understand why you are uncomfortable. Is it that you're feeling uncomfortable because you don't feel seen? You don't feel heard? Is it that you're actually not seen and heard? Because a lot of times we internalize that. And then what happens, what we do to ourselves, we kind of pull ourselves down and shrink ourselves. So get to a place where you could really start using your voice and hear your voice and recognizing that there is a lot of strength and power in your voice, and not only allowing other people to dictate where you're supposed to be and who you're supposed to be. Really being able to use that voice and use that internal power that you do have to speak up and to present yourself. A lot of times, especially for myself in very white spaces, I tend to do that as well. Like, do I belong here? But then I get to a place of like, of course I belong here. I'm here, I am the expert, I belong. So recognize that you belong, recognize that you have power and strength, and you need to also treat yourself the way you want others to actually treat you.
Yeah. Look at it outside from that space. Step outside from that space and look around, and maybe build some allies. But look outside from that environment, and that's how I actually navigate my own journey to different places. I don't put myself into that space. Step outside and take as much time as you can just to recognize that as well.
You know, the only thing I would add to that, sorry, Punita.
No, go ahead.
Give it up to you. I've been talking a lot, so I'm going to give it up.
Are you sure? You can go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, I mean, I echo everything that everyone else is saying. I have found for me, though, there are times when silence is my boundary. I just don't want to engage. There may be something that's happening in a space that is really harmful. And I think silence can be seen, I mean, it can be seen as a form of oppression when we're silencing others. But when we're using silence ourselves, it can also be seen as sort of a tool of resistance. But again, it depends on context, right? There are other contexts where you do need to be able to speak up. I think, just very quickly, the other thing that I have been doing, and it's really helpful, is finding spaces where I do feel comfortable and I'm able to talk, whether it's online meetings with friends or like-minded colleagues, just really informal spaces. That's been super helpful in sort of talking through what might be going on in my mind and what emotions I might be feeling. Go ahead.
Santi.
Yeah, my final thought, I have to run after this, right into another one. I would say, similar to what Natacha was saying, is don't be afraid to take up space. I think something that we do sometimes is if we feel like we need to be invited into the space or given permission to take up space within spaces where we are not a part of the majority or in predominantly white spaces. And there's a lot to unpack there, but because we're short on time, I think what I'll say is just, and it's something I've had to learn as I'm getting older, is don't be afraid to take up space, and don't be afraid to take up space authentically as you are, in the way that, you would express yourself in terms of being authentic to your own culture and your own identities, and what those things mean for you. Because, one of the ways in which white supremacy is normalized is it seeks to make, to colorblind everything, which means that I need to be more like, so-and-so in order for me to be accepted within the space, and it doesn't recognize that it's okay for me to have a Jamaican accent, even though I don't have much of one anymore, but, that kind of thing, right? So, just don't be afraid to take up space, because, we all deserve space on this planet.
What I love about that, and something that's come up for me on multiple mental health conversations, is, as an advocate myself, I have long actually retired my particular story. I revisit once in a while, but that's how I got into the mental health space. I was sharing things that I had gone through. But then I wanted to just highlight others, and B, I got exhausted from it. It took a very big emotional toll. And so I started creating boundaries around that. And what I would tell others since moving forward was, you know, because you see someone speaking up or taking space does not mean you have to. It's listening to yourself. So like I love literally to get, and right now on my screen I'm sandwiched between Punita and Santi, is I love it, Punita, how, you know, I think there's bravery in understanding when you need to just sit back and be silent and take that as your healing. And then Asante, and I think that's also for others to get that nudge to be like, no, I can take up space. I don't have to necessarily create boundaries. Maybe others should create boundaries around themselves. I think the both are important. And I do want to acknowledge there were so many more amazing questions to each of the panelists. And I think what that indicates is just how there's many of us that want to learn, to listen, to better understand how we can navigate in this new climate. So maybe there'll be a part 2, Robin, I don't know. I'm gonna tag Robin in now, but I personally am so honored to have helped in some small way facilitating this conversation. I have learned so much. Asante, Natasha, Emily, Punita. Unfortunately, Suzanne had to leave, but I soaked up so much, so I can only imagine how many others have soaked up. But with that, I'll throw it to Robin.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to the panelists. This was a very honest, open, and meaningful discussion, and I appreciate all of your time, as I'm sure everybody on the Zoom meeting right now does. So thank you, Megan, for moderating. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Hopefully, we can do a part 2 of this in the future, so please keep an eye out, since we did have so much to discuss and did run out of time. But again, you can look for more of this stuff at U of T Sport and Rec, and on behalf of Sport and Rec, Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, and the University of Toronto. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye, everyone. Cheers. Thank you.
Bye.